Introducing Wonderlight, a groundbreaking new Catholic video game from Loyola Press. Wonderlight gives kids a new way to engage with and talk about their faith, putting their lessons of discipleship into practice in a safe and fun way. Kids role-play discipleship in an epic adventure with a customized character that lets children imagine themselves in the world of the game. Learn more at wonderlightgame.com.
OSV is more than what most people think it is. We serve somewhere between 8 and 10 million people with everything from pamphlets to periodicals to books to fundraising, now church management software, religious education, and the list goes on. We're always looking for new ways to serve the church so that individuals, families, and parishes can draw closer to Christ.
Welcome to the NCA 2021 live session entitled Inclusion to Catholic Schools, an overview of the Journal of Catholic Education Special Issue. We have a panel of experts for you today. We invite you to actively engage with this presentation using the messaging and questions functions in the event platform. At the conclusion of the session, you will have the opportunity to complete a post-session evaluation and provide feedback that will also track your participation in our sessions. If you run into any problems, we invite you to refresh your page or use the help section on the event platform. Panelists, thank you for being with us here at NCA 2021, and we turn it over to you to begin.
Well, greetings. My name is Christy Bonfiglio, and I'm very grateful to be here with all of you and so humbled and privileged to be working with this panel of co-editors. As indicated, we're going to be overviewing a special issue that we have put together for Catholic schools on inclusion. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to quickly introduce myself at the moment, and as each panelist begins to speak, they'll give their introduction as well. So I'm Christy Bonfiglio, and I'm from the Alliance for Catholic Education at the University of Notre Dame. I direct the Office of Professional Standards, but my passion is in the Program for Inclusive Education, or PI as we like to call it. I'm a trained school psychologist with expertise in academic and behavioral interventions, as well as service delivery. So I have the pleasure of giving an overview of what this journal, special issue in the Journal of Catholic Ed is all about. And we have been talking for years about a special issue totally devoted to inclusion in Catholic schools. And as you know, we are called in Scripture and Catholic social teaching to serve every child because all children are made in His image. And what we know is that about 1% of students with disabilities attend private schools, 40% of them being Catholic schools. But it doesn't account for all the variability in our classroom. We have students who have some diagnoses under IDEA, students without diagnoses that maybe need to be diagnosed, but we also have those students that struggle. Nonetheless, I know you are experiencing diverse classrooms in your Catholic schools. And so we put together this special issue to explore the issue of inclusion in our schools, which we grounded in theological, moral, and practical considerations. And so we have 7 articles with these corresponding field responses. That is, we sent our articles out to people, we gave them a sneak peek, and we let them reflect on the articles, and we've included those right after each article. Now, each article is solid and could stand on its own merit, but we put it in a schematic, a structure. We based it on theme, and we sequenced them intentionally across these 3 foci. So we talked about why we include, what is inclusion, and how we include. And so the first, why we include, Mike Boyle kicked us off with to act with justice and love tenderly, followed by Michael Fagella-Luby and Max Engel with an article about why inclusion isn't coming, but it's already here. Then we moved to the what is inclusion, where we defined inclusionary practices by Sean Smith and his colleagues. Michael Fagella-Luby and I tackled frameworks for all building capacity for service delivery. And then Sean Smith, again, followed up with evidence-based practices for our unique Catholic context. And finally, we conclude our special issue with how we include with 2 articles. Karen Crow and I wrote Inclusion in Catholic Schools, taking you from inception to implementation, and Eric Carter joined us with The Absence of Asterisks. So I have the privilege of turning it over and letting them explain briefly each of these articles, and then we'll take questions right at the end. I do want to direct your attention to that QR code at the bottom. That will take you, if you take your camera out and you take a picture of it, it will take you right to the special issue, so you'll have access to our writing. So I'm happy to turn it over to Mike now.
Well, good morning. My name is Mike Boyle. And just a quick little something about myself. When I first started working along with our colleagues as on this particular venture, I was the director of the Greeley Center for Catholic Education at Loyola Chicago. But previous to all of this, when you look at that list, it looks like I can't really hold a job because I've had lots of different kinds of experiences. I first kind of started off as a school psychologist working with a variety of different handicapping conditions, ultimately kind of worked my way up and became a high school department chair for special education, moving on to the district level as a special education director. I left the public school realm and left and became a Catholic school principal, where I used all those lessons that I learned about special education and serving all students in being able to do that in a Catholic school. Just recently, I've left the Greeley Center and now am the superintendent of the Diocese of Joliet, which is located right outside of Chicago. And the purpose of the article that I did is I really wanted to sort of synthesize a lot of different documents. If you really look at kind of our church has got some really great kind of papers and documents really about supporting persons with disabilities in a variety of different settings, in church, in schools, and so, but they're all in separate places. So what I tried to do within this particular article is really sort of synthesize. So this particular article starts with really the Catholic social teaching tradition, looking about how we can use Catholic social teaching as sort of a foundation to look at inclusion, specifically within Catholic schools. And then looking at the American Catholic Church and looking at the number of articles from the U.S. Catholic bishops, starting with the framework. There's some some really richly beautiful kinds of documents about supporting persons with disabilities and how we need to start looking at that within a Catholic school experience. And then finally, there's the National Catholic Partnership on Disability, which is sort of an advisory group that helps to advise the U.S. Catholic bishops on a variety of different disability topics, and there are some really good articles. So basically what I did is try to take a lot of these documentations, put them in one place so that people could easily access them. But ultimately, when we look at sort of a framework for disabilities, I think when we look at the training that we often get around disabilities, it really comes from, kind of an older model, which is the medical model, which looks at it as deficit and a deficit orientation in terms of looking at disability. And then we look oftentimes at the interface between the medical and the legal model in most of our preparation programs, whether or not they're teacher training programs or leadership principle preparation. We look at, IDEA and looking at the legal requirements, and as if that is sort of the gold measure of what we need to be doing with persons with disabilities. And what we need to start adding, especially as Catholic school educators, is this theological model. And it really is, I think when we start looking at programming for students with disabilities, it's really about acknowledging the kind of the anthropology of the human person in terms of what we believe as Catholics, and how we're really, as Catholic educators, really held to a higher standard, not just a legal standard, which some writers would suggest is really kind of a low, kind of a minimal estimate of what we need to be doing, but really thinking about looking at how we conceptualize the person and how we value all people. And so looking at all of these documents, kind of bringing them all together. And in my particular article, I had the response from Jan Benton, who is the former executive director of the National Catholic Partnership, which again, she brought some additional documentation to this particular discussion and looking at the sacramental preparation for persons with disabilities. So again, starting off as sort of a foundation, kind of a beginning point, let's look at what our church currently says. And so that's where we start with the first article in this particular special edition of the Journal of Catholic Education.
All right, and we'll pick it up there with the second article, the second why article. Max Engel at Creighton University and I talked about why inclusion isn't coming. It's already here. Those of you out in schools, you certainly know you have kids with disabilities in your school right now. You have variability and academic diversity that you deal with on a daily basis. So we wanted to touch on that, and as an extension of Mike's why, we add in as well. Go ahead, Kristen. So just a little bit about Max and I. I'm a professor of special education at Texas Christian University here in Fort Worth, Texas. I direct our Alice Neely Special Education Research and Service, or ANSWERS Institute. But like many of you, I'm a former Catholic school teacher. I taught high school at Bishop Kenny High School in Jacksonville, Florida. Hello to any folks who might be chiming in today. I also had the privilege, after teaching chemistry and English, of being an administrator, working as an assistant dean of students with students there. And I'm also currently the past president of the Division for Learning Disabilities from the largest disability organization in the US, the Council for Exceptional Children. All right, so my partner in crime on this, and it was such a pleasure, was Dr. Max Engel, who's at Creighton University, an assistant professor. In fact, soon to be associate professor, I understand. What's really nice about Max's work is he exists at the crossroads that many of you exist at, the crossroads of theology and education. Mike gave us such a nice jumping off point. Max, with his expertise, continues that. Again, though, a former Catholic school teacher and administrator, Kevin, a graduate of the REMIC program, and also an author. One of his two most recent books is Your School's Catholic Identity, Claim It, Build It. This is a book worth checking out. Let's talk about what's in the article and how we've taken these perspectives that hopefully mirror your own, and talk a little bit about the field of why inclusion. So the take-home message really from both the articles I'm going to talk about are really this idea of including students with disabilities in our Catholic schools. It's more than just a good idea. It fits within our Catholic faith as the right thing to do. And we're going to specifically talk about that in terms of Catholic social teaching. Sean and Christy and I did a national survey that many of you may have participated in. That was the #1 reason folks said they were including kids with disabilities in Catholic schools, was the Catholic social teaching that drives our larger faith. But also, we want to recognize that you're likely already serving students with disabilities in your school. So our hope here is that we will affirm your efforts, what you're doing on a daily basis, that will ground our work in shared beliefs across our Catholic schools as a network, and that we provide some justification to validate that journey, because it's not an easy journey, is it? But it's an important one. In terms of an overview for our article, again, why for us was really grounded in Catholic social teaching. Max's background in theology touches on many of these foundational documents in the church and traces where we go with Catholic social teaching as part of our larger faith, and then how Catholic schools fit into that mission that we share. The second piece we get into is, all right, so how do we envision inclusion? And we try and really give you a continuum of models to think about. Our friends at St. James in San Diego gave us a wonderful graphic way to visualize what's happening in schools so that you can see where you are and where you aspire to be. And we hope that as we span the ability to get our students into least restrictive environments, as Mike said, that sort of higher calling for us is to move them towards where they can spend more time with their typical achieving peers. We thought we'd finish by getting practical as a bridge from the why to the what articles that I'm about to talk about, by debunking some common misconceptions. We tackle 5 misconceptions. For example, if we engage in inclusion, many people are worried that only students with disabilities will benefit. You know that's not true if you've been including kids. We talk about how some people think, well, just good teaching will solve the problem, but we know it's so much more than that. And so we try and help you with language to respond to these common misconceptions so you can begin moving towards those least restrictive environments for your student. So that's the why inclusion article.
Well, good morning. My name is Sean Smith, and I'm excited here to share a little bit about the next article in this series, this special issue. First of all, I'm a faculty member at the University of Kansas. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Notre Dame with the PI program that Christy mentioned. My colleagues come at it from a variety of different perspectives. Greg is a faculty member, a colleague here at the University of Kansas. Jen is a colleague at the University of Maryland. Former Catholic educators, worked primarily, Greg and Jen, in the pre-K through 3rd grade environment, aligning us with the idea that, of course, when we bring our children in, and of course, the family component, which I'll get to in just a moment. Greg is actually the editor of a very practitioner-oriented journal, Young Exceptional Children, which is widely read for that pre-K up through the primary ages. And like Michael, I've been fortunate to serve in a leadership capacity within the technology division for the Council for Exceptional Children called ISET. Now, our article, kind of continuing along the direction that Michael and Mike just shared, then gets us into this idea of inclusion. And interestingly enough, when we look for definitions of inclusion, we don't get a lot of direction from the Department of Education or from a national perspective. There are not a lot of definitions out there for us to hold our hat on, saying, well, this is what folks say in terms of directing us. But at the end of the day, we see inclusion very much equal to our efforts in Catholicism. So we are supporting the rights, and we try to emphasize this of every child, very much part of what we try to do within our Catholic teachings that build upon what Mike and Michael shared in their previous articles, and regardless of who they are in terms of their ability. Now, we also integrate elements in, and we do this in combination also with Jill Reffitt, who is the director of Embrace, which is a Kansas City, Kansas-based inclusionary effort across a number of Catholic schools in the Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri archdiocese. And Jill offers a respondent, but Jill's also a family member. And we expand this idea of inclusion to not only include, of course, our Catholic schools, but also our parish and the families we serve and families we are, in respect to that, of course, the overall inclusionary efforts that we are built on as part of our church. So within that, then we try to emphasize the benefits of inclusion, and there are so many. As Michael already mentioned, trying to deal with the variability of the learners that we serve. In addition, and if you can move the slide, Christy, that would be awesome. We also deal with the academic, the social, emotional, and instructional. We see that all students benefit when students are included. And we can do this individualized, specialized instruction while also within what we would call the general education environment or the inclusionary environment. And the families, when we do this type of work, both in the Catholic environment and in the public school environment, are very positive to this. And a list of things goes on in terms of the benefits of inclusionary efforts across our Catholic schools. Now, one element we try to reinforce, and honestly, because of space, we didn't have a chance to, and that is, this is not special education from the perspective of oftentimes we think of it from a public school perspective. As Michael mentioned, he served in public schools and special education, as I have as well. And we've created a model with staffing, with funding, with structure, with different places. And in all honesty, this is what Catholic education is so ripe for, further inclusionary, because it really needs to, as many public school efforts are going to now. It's more back to that inclusionary, back to that general education, back to all of us working together to meet the variability of all learners. And the last slide here that we tried to get us thinking about in the special issue as we then transition into how do we do it is the different elements. And I'm going to talk about this here in a second article that we emphasized in evidence-based practices. But many of these things, and it's a laundry list, as we look at these as classroom teachers or as classroom leaders or building leaders, we'll see, wait, these are things we're doing for all learners to begin with. And that's very much an emphasis of what we're trying to do as we transition out of this article.
All right, I get a chance to sort of keep going with the what. Sean set that up nicely for us in terms of practices, but for some of us, we sort of scratch our heads about how do we do this systemically? We don't want teachers to be in classrooms and feel like they're all by themselves in these efforts. That's not what meaningful inclusion is about. It's about having a way to build capacity in your service delivery to meet the needs of all students, but especially those students who have additional needs. So Christy, go ahead. In terms of the overview here of this particular article, Christy and I try and walk you through some key components, similar to what I talked about before, this idea of how can I envision, based on the resources I already have, some sort of continuum of inclusion, the different models of service delivery that fit well in Catholic schools. 1 in 5 adults, according to the CDC, has a disability. That actually mirrors really well what we know, which is from my own work in post-secondary education and disability, 1 in 5 college students has a disability. And in fact, about 50% of college students with disabilities don't disclose those disabilities. So we know, regardless of where kids are, there are kids with disabilities. You want to make sure that there are components of good instruction in place, good systems thinking to help you build your capacity around service delivery. So that's what we really spend our time in, didn't we, Christy? Thinking about 5 critical elements of what we call MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. The name isn't as important as the components themselves. Knowing what place the kids are in, sort of screening them for where are we, who are these kids we're getting, then implementing good research-based or evidence-based practices, making sure you follow up to see that they're responding to the good instruction that you're giving, that we're implementing those interventions as they were designed so we can really get the biggest bang for the buck. How do we do that collectively as a group through collaboration, teaming, thinking about the leveraging of all of our human capacity? And so we give you those 5 critical elements with some specific examples. And then we try and reflect on how those features can uniquely align to Catholic schools. And again, I'll go back to this. The special issue is about moving you from the why to the what. I'm going to go into the how in a second. This is really trying to ground you in, if that why is really speaking to my heart, this is where I can start. I can sort of begin my blueprint for making a difference for the students that I'm working with.
And so the opportunity that followed here was the idea that, well, wait a minute here. So if we're actually going to try to do, so I'm believing it. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. I'm willing to start making the Kool-Aid with you. And so Greg and another colleague, Maggie Mosier, who has had a wide experience in both public and parochial education, and she was the founding director of the Embrace program. And so again, that's an inclusionary program working across several archdioceses here in the Kansas City area. Anyways, with that, our emphasis here with the evidence-based, and first of all, let's go ahead and define evidence-based. Our effort was to re-emphasize or to emphasize with many of us that, the wheel is out there. It's been designed. It's not that we are reinventing it and or we have to invent it. There's a number of experiences out there to direct us, a number of practices out there, strategies, interventions out there to direct us in our efforts. And so with that, of course, we couched it under this idea of evidence-based, because of course, that is very much representative of what the field in education has been trying to direct, dictate, et cetera, over the last several decades. And so with that in mind, for this brief presentation, what we tried to emphasize in the article was different types of evidence-based practices. So on the next slide, we emphasize here, there's been centers that have been created so that we're not forced to go looking at the literature as a classroom teacher, although that's where it's guiding us. But there's been places that have translated, and not only translated, but placed into lesson forms and areas in terms of reading, writing, math, social emotional development, behavioral, etc. And so in our article, what we're trying to do is give us a bit of a taste, as well as give us an understanding of resources. So for example, this is the National Center of Intensive Interventions, supported by our federal government, but to give practitioners easy to use things on everything from vocabulary to reading comprehension and everything in between. The next slide emphasizes really the gold standard, and that is, of course, the Institute of Educational Sciences, which has tried to put out a map about, okay, these truly are evidence-based. But there's additional resources. So, for example, the next slide emphasizes the fact that in special education, we've identified high leverage practices. Well, high leverage practices, evidence-based, we go into that a little bit into the article. But more importantly, back to the fact that we're trying to include these individuals in our classrooms with all individuals, there are 4 general areas that the high leverage practice field has emphasized: collaboration being one, assessment being another, instructional elements being another, and the last is social emotional behavioral. Now, in each area, they've identified ways to do it. And so it's not just simply saying, well, we need to collaborate, but very specific ways that we need to further develop as professionals, and in a way, guiding folks like Notre Dame and other teacher development universities, where they're directing faculty members to also guide future educators, as well as current educators in the field. So I'm going to come back to that slide I had in that previous article in this last slide and emphasize the fact that many of these practices, they are practices that you need to do with fidelity, but they're practices that are not necessarily new to us. So for example, mentoring, particularly peer mentoring, has been written about, growing more and more extensively and used in a number of different schools. Actually, the school we emphasize in the article we share has done it at the high school level, a college prep experience, but done so in a very much inclusionary experience where a number of individuals can benefit from a number of these practices in electives, as well as embedded in content-related courses. So with that, I'll move on, and there you go.
All right, and so I had the pleasure of working with Karen Crow on this next article, From Inception to Implementation. And Karen is the Associate Superintendent for Student Services at the Archdiocese of Kansas City, Kansas. She's been there about 16 years and supervises 42 schools with their implementation of inclusionary practices. She's also adjunct faculty at Benedictine, earning degrees in both special education and at leadership. And so the purpose of this article was kind of to connect the dots for you. I mean, Mike and Michael and Sean have all talked about the why and the components that we need, what good inclusion is. We were hoping that we could take you from inception to implementation. So we did some defining of some of these same practices in a brief manner. But what we wanted to do was to outline our article and define the barriers that have been historically expressed for inclusion in Catholic schools. And that's a lack of culture, resources, and knowledge and skills. And so when we're looking at culture, we're talking about that resistance to inclusion, and not because Catholic educators don't have a heart for it, but it's because they believe that students need specialized instruction that they don't know how to do. And so being able to meaningfully include students with disabilities, struggling learners, does require those evidence-based practices, those high leverage practices, programming. And to implement that, you need trained personnel, you need professional development. And so having the time and the resource for that training becomes an obstacle. And finally, educators indicate that they just don't know how. And not that they don't want to, but they don't know how. They want to effectively serve the diverse learning needs, and they need training to do so. So we consistently hear that lack of training or lack of knowledge about how to do it is at the top of the list. And so we organized this article specifically around those barriers. We addressed the barriers with effective practice. And so as indicated, you need buy-in with your stakeholders. We need to be working with our educators, our parents, our students, our parishioners, because this is a community process. We need to wrap around the entire school, and everyone has to have buy-in. But in order to embrace it, knowing if we're ready for it and having a needs assessment, understanding what it is, where we are on that continuum that Michael spoke about, and where we are going is really important. And therefore, our article presents some ways to think about funding, but it also presents a number of organizations such as Embrace and National Catholic Board on Full Inclusion and FIRE, to name just a few, that talk about advocacy. These are generous and gracious groups who are willing to share documents and information on ways to fund and to build programming. And so they share some of that how-to, as well as how to interact and to build some of those parent groups. They're happy to help. So now that we know some of this stuff, our article finished with, okay, well, now let's get started. So it's time to establish those frameworks, MTSS, UDL, those evidence-based practices and high leverage practices. And with that takes professional development. We need to be training our educators and our students for, as Sean indicated, some peer mentoring services if you implement that. And so we outlined some of those processes. Finally, our manuscript ends, we give you an example. We provide a case scenario to walk you through. And Karen Hobson was our respondent and also provided a reflection. She's done some implementation of inclusion in Kansas City. So she responded and reflected on this article. And so it's just further information and insight.
And then the final article, I'll be speaking for Dr. Carter, who couldn't be with us this morning, although he does have an on-demand session that you can access a little bit later. But Dr. Carter from Vanderbilt, and again, has a number of different kinds of experiences around inclusion. So he really brings that sense of kind of practicality, to this particular kind of discussion. And I think one of the things I think for me when I look at this particular article is this framework that he offers, these 10 dimensions of belonging. And in his article, what he does is he takes this, this framework here and he sort of unpeels it like an onion. And he talks about, how this can be really present, within a school setting. And I think it in a way it's kind of a sense of a continuum of sometimes when we look at inclusionary kind of programs, we think once it's kind of a binary choice, you're in or you're out. But in fact, he really lays out a very well thought out sort of discussion about what this looks like in the continuum of, once you're in the door, what it could look like, whether or not you're, kind of looking and thinking about a fully included person within a school. And I think what the sort of the position of this particular article is really good, because what it does is it sort of wraps back to some of the very basic things in the first article about looking at sort of this theological kind of perspective, not just a legal model or a medical model, but really sort of a theological perspective in terms of looking at this, and really makes the case for looking at inclusion within the life of a religious-based school within a parish. And then his respondent is Ann Masters. And if you're familiar with Ann's been really involved in disability ministry in a number of different forums, in a number of different dioceses. And she's done additional graduate work in that particular area. And then she offers particular commentary on this. So again, I would urge you to check out the online or the on-demand session with Dr. Carter, and to be able to kind of get a better sense of how he's presenting this and discussing it. But I think there's a sense of utility with this particular framework that I can be really helpful in terms of looking at this in terms of applied settings like Catholic schools.
Thank you, Mike. And I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Mike said. Eric has an on-demand session. The other articles that we've just briefly overviewed, there are on-demand sessions as well, so that you could take a peek at them and get a deeper dive into each of them. And so please feel free to check them out. And so as we conclude here, we're just taken back to Pope Francis and the fact that, we're called to do this, and it's about relationships, and it's about the community, and And we know the why, and we've given you resources for the what, but it's about ensuring that all students have a place at our table. The door is open for all students to have a Catholic education. And so we hope this special issue has provided some structure for you to kind of take you through the steps, and you are always welcome to reach out to any of us for some additional assistance and for some professional development in taking you through this. And so as we conclude here, I'm going to stop sharing our screen so that we can join in a Q&A for the remainder of the time. But we thank you for your attention, and we welcome your questions. All right, it looks like we have one question in the chat. It is, how can standards-based service learning foster inclusion in Catholic schools?
Christy, you want us to just sort of jump in maybe with some initial thoughts? I'll jump in with my initial thoughts, and then Sean can correct me. We'll do it the usual way. Is that
Yeah.
Do it? Okay.
That's the dance. It's generally I start, but go ahead, you start this time.
Thank you again for being part of the session, the conversation. When it comes to the idea of sort of service learning, standards-based service learning, connecting it to, at least what little I know about it, thinking about how our standards ask us to think about sort of the academic development of the individual. I think one of the real opportunities of service learning, we all engage in this for obvious reasons, right? It's about the whole individual's growth. One of the things that seems so critical is that when we engage in service learning, we all get to see the different life genius that we have. We get to bring that variability that Sean talks about to the things that we do. And yet we sort of get in the question here, this idea of, I should restate the question, sorry. How can standards-based service learning foster inclusion in Catholic schools? What I see is two components. One is it makes meaningful the connection back, the student actions that are academic back to these standards of what we try and address in terms of service learning, but also it allows children who may struggle with certain academic tasks to also show these other skills that they have. And in the collaboration of the two, they begin to make meaning of why I want to do these things in school and how I can use them outside of school. The world becomes much more open to them. And think about it from a peer perspective. I may have somebody in class who's not particularly good at a particular science topic or whatever, math, whatever. Then I get to see this person in a complete light as a whole human being. I think that's a really nice way to put those two things together. And it speaks to the heart of why we include kids.
Michael, I imagine you have a perspective on this in terms of what you're living. In terms of that first question, in terms of standard-based, or any of those. I'm going to jump in on that second one when we get a chance.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of looking ahead at some of the other questions, and I wanted to jump to looking at what the MTSS model would look like in Catholic schools.
Sure.
And I think from my perspective, and again, one of the things should be pointed out, there are several resources related to a lot of the topics from this particular talk that are available through the NCEA website, through the bookstore. So I would really suggest that, some of this, there's some additional help in those areas. But I think the one thing about MTSS is that it's just good teaching. And it's good instructional planning, and it's good programming for students. And so, I don't think it has a particular look to it, but I think that if you look at the elements of MTSS, I think what it does is it really, kind of honors where students are at and looking at sort of what their individual needs are. And it's really about how schools organize themselves and create the supports around that. And I think the one thing that Catholic schools can do really well, because there's such flexibility in what we do and how we do it, I think that we really can organize ourselves really well to create these kinds of systems to really support all students.
And I know Michael and Christy have perspectives on this, so I'm going to transition as a quick comment, building upon you, Michael, is that I think there's a culture component that's identified with Catholic schools is we are built-in collaborators. We're already interchanging versus with the MTSS framework, oftentimes The challenge is in our environments where it's fairly structured and fairly isolated, which that's something, again, I think that we already have there. But again, Michael and Christy, I know you're much more, you'd have thoughts on the MTSS framework.
Well, yeah, I wanted to echo what you said, Sean. I mean, I was a Catholic school educator teaching 2 different subjects, coaching the girls volleyball team. I think like most of you, holding up my corner of the building on alternate Tuesdays, right? Like we are used to having to think about what can I do to help? And that's just so much what drives us in terms of the service of being a Catholic school educator. I think the piece that I would link between these two, and then I'll kick it to Christy, is I think that, nationally, 80% of kids with disabilities are spending more than 80% of their time with their typical achieving peers. That investing in understanding MTSS, what Mike calls good teaching, right? The idea of, I do want to have good, solid assessment in place. I want to have good core reading curriculum in my school. Everybody wants that. So when I invest in the professional development of my teachers, my staff, I am investing in the better outcome for both my students, but also the culture that I'm in. I mean, everybody's job satisfaction is going to go up when I can truly live the mission of meeting the needs of all the students that I have. And each of those components, I think Sean talked about, has that research base or that evidence base that will make what we do so much more effective. Christy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I know we only have about 8 more minutes left, and so I want to make sure that we get to some additional questions here. It looks like questions are coming in, but I would affirm all the statements that were currently met. And thinking about MTSS both in an academic perspective, but also that behavioral perspective when we're talking about preventing and positive behaviors, because I noticed there's a question here about behaviors, and we get this question about how do we have conversations with parents who are recommending that we push kids with behavioral issues out? And I think part of that comes back down to culture and relationships and building a safe environment for students to feel like they can learn and they can fail and they can try again. And I know that those of you who have been administrators and superintendents would probably have a perspective on those conversations that you've dealt with day to day. But I think a lot of it comes down to creating a culture of acceptance and creating a culture and in training behaviors. I take it back to these can't do's and won't do's. We have students who can't do things behaviorally either or socially either, and we have to teach them those skills. And then we have kids who need a little bit more motivation. They just won't do it. And I think identifying some of those, which comes back to good assessment and figuring out why things occur, will allow us to support all students and change the culture in our building.
Well, I think it's really interesting too, because I think that also comes back to kind of this MTSS framework, because it's not just about academics, it's also about social, emotional, behavioral. And we have to think about, as Catholic schools, what are the ways that we're supporting the social, emotional, behavioral development of our students in addition to the academics, which, by the way, if we believe that we instruct the whole child, we should be having those things that are in place. And part of this is that, when behavior becomes an issue, that's because there are some skills that probably haven't been taught prior to that. So if we do a lot of the preventative work, we probably could offset some of the higher kind of issues that really cause parents to call. So, a lot of it is it's prevention before we get to intervention. So, as a school, what could we be doing to think about, develop better approaches to social, emotional, behavioral kinds of interventions, and how are we doing that with our kids?
This is where I think the pandemic has offered a bit of a silver lining, because we're talking more about some of these issues about, one, the variability of our learners. Although we may have been face to face, but with our mask and a social distance, I think this last year, we've realized that there's a lot of variability with what we thought were our typical learners, including that social emotional component that maybe we've been pausing on, and we're going to address this coming fall. Those, to me, are inroads for our families to say, these are things collectively we're doing for everybody. And by the way, they make me see a little bit more of a connection because of this past year. And by the way, in doing so, there's an extension, a continuum, where we'll allow for that variability for that one student or two students that in the past we tend to target or see as different. And therefore, we can then see ways to not only preach it, but also live it in some of these aspects. So,
there's a question in here. Someone asked, I think this is wonderful. I'm wondering if there'd be a group of educators interested in an article study focused on this issue. Would the authors consider offering something like this? I mean, this is a we thing. And Sean's right to talk about, and I appreciate when he does talk about silver linings to COVID, because it's hard to find them sometimes. But this is a we issue. And actually, there's some questions down below about costs. You know, one of the things that, let's sort of put these things together. The special issue is available to you. Use that QR code. Get those as a community, as a parish. Begin talking about all these different ideas. Free to you. You have access to that. Then recognize that because we know cost is a problem, most of what Sean shared in terms of evidence-based practices, you've already paid for. Those are freely available because they were funded by IES or NSF studies. You can have free access to those as well. So starting with a conversation around the special issue, reaching out to us, we'd love to hear from you, thinking about those free resources that are available. You know, we worked in a school where when the parents heard that kids with disabilities are going to be included, the single biggest concern was whether they would need a fundraiser to have an elevator moved into the school. That tells us they're not really clear on what disability means. And I think that's maybe the first place to start that conversation, which is why Mike's piece and Max and I around the why is a great place to start. And I like that Mike keeps pulling us into MTSS and thinking about, okay, well, how can I do this? And how am I already doing this? No one is at ground zero on this. This is about figuring out what do I do well, and then where do I build on those things looking forward. Very, very doable.
You know, and I see some of these elements also very much aligned with what we've done in the past as Catholic educators. And that is, we'll have initiatives for the year, or maybe across several years, aligned with maybe some literacy we're trying to bring in, or maybe it's some community aspects, or maybe elements of the social teachings of the church we're trying to further integrate. And so how will we do that? We'll do it through selective readings. We'll do it through some additional professional learning. We'll do it through engaging the entire parish culture and family to support with a number of different activities that are very visual. The same thing is happening here in terms of introducing additional evidence-based practices that potentially and most probably will be available and useful for all learners, but particularly some of these individuals that we've in the past neglected and that we need to very purposely try to include. And so I see it very much aligned with what things we've done in the past, and therefore the family and the culture will see it similar, but of course a little bit more specific, a little bit more explicit for the needs of those with disabilities.
Just some additional resources that you might want to think about, you know, because people have been asking about the professional development.
Right.
Catholic higher ed is a phenomenal place to do. You know, you've got the PI program right at Notre Dame. You've got the Greeley Center at Loyola Chicago. You've got, you know, Loyola Marymount with Vicki Graff. You know, there's a variety of different Catholic colleges and universities around that are looking to help partner. And, you know, we're all, well, I used to be, but, you know, higher ed is all nonprofit, right? So, I mean, they're not going to be just terribly expensive, and they can work with you to be able to look at how you might be able to leverage some of your title monies, and so that you can make this, you know, kind of more affordable. The other option too is that some of these things, you know, definitely have a public school bent, and you might be able to partner with your LEA to be able to participate in some of the local, obviously you're not going to get the faith element of that, but you know, you could get some of the skill development by definitely going to your LEA and asking for, you know, to be included in some of that. And a lot of, more often than not, LEAs are really wanting to partner, because it does make their job a little bit easier when they have to think about identification and other aspects. So, you know, there's ways to be able to, you know, kind of leverage some of the resources that you already have to be able to get sort of the very specific kinds of training that you might need.
Well, and I just want to affirm too, Mike, that, I mean, that's how this collaboration started. We were at NCA several years ago, and we sat down to dinner and said, you know, we gotta write a special issue. We need to be working together. I think institutions of higher ed, Catholic institutions, need to do a better job of collaborating and assisting our Catholic schools. And from that, I mean, I know Greeley Center has free resources. The PI website has free resources on it, where we have a webinar every first or second Tuesday of every month that talks. Last one was about title funds. So, and even Michael talked about those myths of inclusion. Sean will be joining us soon too. So there's plenty of free out there, but we are also willing to partner with some professional development. We're traveling, and we have educator prep programs that they become the leader at the Greeley Center or the teacher leader at the PI. And then they're able to do their own professional learning. We're training the trainers and hopefully spreading inclusion at a more robust speed.
I think we've run out of time.
Thank you.
So thank you. We hope you check out that special issue. Again, you can use the QR code, and you can also go to the on-demand sessions to take a deeper dive into all of these articles. So we appreciate your time, and let us know if we can be of assistance.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you all for attending this live session at NCA 2021. Please make sure to complete the post-session evaluation and use this opportunity to check out the other live and on-demand sessions, our learning lounges, our virtual exhibit hall, and so much more. We'll see you soon.